Good afternoon, everyone. If you could go ahead and take your seats, we're about to start. Welcome to session 3 of the Denial of International Religious Freedom track for our event addressing denial of international religious freedom moving forward. I'm Olivia Enos, the Washington Director for the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, and I was so excited when I was asked to moderate this panel. Few things are more productive than identifying next steps for how we can best defend international religious freedom. For my day job, I focus on Hong Kong, a place where freedoms of all stripes disappeared quite literally overnight in 2020. Working on this issue reminds me of the importance of defending freedom wherever it is under threat. One day, Hong Kong was a free, prosperous, capitalist society. Today, it operates under the thumb of Beijing. Just last week, the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation hosted an event featuring USERF Chair Nuri Turkle to talk about the state of religious freedom in Hong Kong. He used that time to consider not only the future threats to religious freedom, but the current ongoing ones, like the detention of religious prisoners of conscience. Many of us know Jimmy Lai, a faithful Catholic, also Protestant Joshua Wong, who many of us met just on the steps of the Capitol in recent years. And we've also borne witness to the active persecution of Hong Kong Cardinal Joseph Zen. Nuri, our speaker, has of course borne witness to the Chinese Communist Party's repression in many contexts, including against the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, Falun Gong, and others. And he knows full well the consequences of failing to address religious repression right from the start. Nuri's remarks at our event served as a reminder of how much is still yet to be done. Things like offering safe haven, perhaps in the form of priority to refugee status to survivors of religious persecution in China, or the need to prioritize the release of political prisoners, or frankly speaking, to just be good friends to those refugees and survivors of religious persecution who have been resettled in our own neighborhoods. Nuri reminded the audience, as I hope we will do today, that every single person in this room has an important role to play in defending religious freedom wherever it is under threat. This panel is unique in that it doesn't just bring together one stakeholder to discuss the path forward. It's bringing together government officials currently serving, former government officials, civil society, and survivors of religious persecution, all of whom are here to share their insights, their lessons learned, and best practices for defending religious liberty. This unique intersection of stakeholders is incredibly inclusive, ensuring that the voices and perspectives of those who come at these issues from all different angles are represented all in one place in this room. That excites me because the momentum from this summit, from this panel, it doesn't have to end here. Today, we have an opportunity to propel future action and to inspire others to get involved. We have a very, very full session today. This is, I think, incredibly uniquely organized, in fact, and I want to provide you a little bit with a roadmap so that you know kind of where we're going from here. So you've already heard from me. We're going to hear next from a couple of survivors who have already gone through many of the perils of what it is like to survive persecution. Then I'm going to be joined by Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, who's going to moderate the first portion of the session, talking to government officials about their views on how we can best defend religious freedom. Then we're going to be inviting people who have participated in all 3 of our panels over the last several days so that they can share from a civil society standpoint what the solutions are that they think we should pursue as next steps. And we're going to hear again from government officials responding and saying, how can we turn this into practical action? So we're going to be hearing from several different government panels, some of whom are former duty bearers, some of whom are current duty bearers serving in the government. And then we're also going to hear from survivors. I think this is such a unique intersection of the panel, and so I'm really delighted to have that today. Before I hand it over to Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, I'd like to first invite up our very first survivor to present. His name is Shakib Nasrallah. He is a Baha'i survivor of persecution from Iran So without further ado, I'll invite Shakib up, and then next we will hear from Simon Zhang, a Falun Gong survivor from China. So Shakib, please join us here on the stage.
Thank you. My name is Shakib Nasrullah. I grew up post-1979 Islamic Revolution. By the time I reached the university age, my family, all Baha'is, already had their share of systematic persecution against the largest religious minority of Iran. For example, the Iranian regime had fired my father from his job due to being a Baha'i, and my sister had been expelled from the school several times simply because she was a Baha'i. I knew that the Iranian regime banned Baha'is from universities, so my only option was to attend an underground community-run university called Baha'i Institute for Higher Education, or BIHE. BIHE has been the only hope for thousands of Baha'i students deprived of access to higher education. This is a university like no other. There is no campus, as students from various parts of the country gather together in Tehran, and their lodgings and classes are the homes of Baha'is. In 2007, after finishing my bachelor's in psychology from BIHE, I continued my studies at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. I finished my master's in counseling psychology in 2009. As my heart was with all those Baha'i students who needed help at BIHE, I went back to Iran and started teaching at BIHE. My mother continued to host classes and served tea and cookies at the end of these classes. As BIHE is a service-based university, I had to find another way to earn a living. Through a friend, I was fortunate to find a work at a clinic as a counselor. This was rather clandestine, since if they knew I was a Baha'i, I would get fired. All this turned upside down when in 2011 the intelligence service of Iran attacked many houses of Baha'i students and professors across the country to stop the activities of this university. On Tuesday, September 13th, 2011, I was summoned for interrogations at the notorious Evin prison of Tehran. They kept me for 9 days in solitary confinement and then a day in shared cell with 2 other Baha'is. My interrogators threatened that I would never see the light of the day. They wanted me to refrain from teaching at BIHE, claiming it was illegal and that we didn't have the right to get educated. I denied their request and insisted on my right as an Iranian citizen to access higher education. They let me go, but kept harassing me and others simply because we were Baha'is teaching psychology subjects at the BIHE. About a year later, after I moved to Canada, they informed my family that I had received a 4 years imprisonment sentence, forcing my father to pay the full equivalent of that bail that he had set for me. My Baha'i colleagues spent the next 4 or 5 years of their lives in prison for teaching psychology. Yet this was still nothing compared to the imprisonment of some other Baha'is, like Fariba Kamalabadi or Mahvash Sabit, who spent 10 years in prison and recently got another 10 years of imprisonment simply because they were Baha'is. These imprisonments and government-ordered killings, confiscations of properties, and etc., came at the time when hundreds are shot and thousands of Iranians are imprisoned in the recent uprising of Iranians for their rights. And obviously I got expelled from my previous job as well, at the clinic that I used to work. For many Baha'is like myself, what is happening to the majority now is what has been happening to various minorities of that same country over the past 40 years. I'm thankful for this opportunity to state my testimony and hope that we can be the voice of all Iranians suffering currently in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Simon Zhang. I am an architect in New York. I'm here to share a story of my mom. This is her photo, quite a lady. Unfortunately, she died in custody last March in China, simply for practicing Falun Gong, a spiritual practice in the Buddhist tradition. Since the persecution of Falun Gong started in 1999, she was sent to forced labor camps twice. First in 2001 and then in 2008, right before the Beijing Summer Olympics. In forced labor camps, she was tortured by police using electric batons for 2 hours until she had an involuntary urination and her face was burnt. That torture destroyed her health, but the abuse did not stop there. Both times, we were only allowed to bring her home when she was about to die due to the severe torture and abuses. Last year, in 2022, she was arrested again on the Chinese New Year, 3 days before the Beijing Winter Olympics. In detention center, she went on hunger strike to protest the arbitrary detention. The guards responded with torture, forced feeding, and humiliation. As a result, she lost consciousness and was sent to hospital, where she was handcuffed to bed for the last month of her life. They also placed iron fetters on her ankles. On March 21, 40 days after she was arrested, my mom died. My father demanded an explanation but was only met with indifference. Instead, nearly 50 policemen guarded my mom's body and monitored my parents' apartment. On April 7th, my mom was cremated. My father was forced to give permission after the police threatened they would fire my cousin, who is my father's close nephew, from his government job. They also threatened my father, using photos of me joining Falun Gong events in the United States, telling him that they know everything about what's happening here. My mom had one strong wish to see for herself how we can practice Falun Gong freely in the United States. A few years ago, she planned to visit me here, but her passport application was denied because she practiced Falun Gong. Now she would never have that chance. In the 65 years of her life, the last 23 years were filled with surveillance, harassment, arrest, torture, and abuses. My entire family also suffered for 23 years because of this. All she did was to stay faithful to the principles of Falun Gong, truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. She refused to give them up, even in the face of physical and mental torture by the communist regime. My family is only one of the millions of families torn apart by this persecution, and in my own experience, I have seen so many of my close friends and close fellow practitioners, their family were torn apart in front of my eyes. My mom is just one of over 4,900 documented cases of Falun Gong practitioners who died due to torture and abuses. Another untold number of Falun Gong practitioners, likely hundreds of thousands, have been killed through forced organ harvesting. This is a much, much bigger crime than China's human rights issue. What the Chinese Communist regime has done to Falun Gong, including my mom, is a genocide, and it's a crime against humanity. Thank you very much.
Well, let me begin by thanking these two incredibly powerful witnesses who have shared their extraordinary testimonies. I must say to our dear Baha'i friend, I had the opportunity a few years ago to become acquainted with a beautiful young woman. I remember her first name, not her last, Niknaz, who was also a graduate of BIHI, the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education. And I remember being so amazed at the caliber and the resiliency and the aspiring for goodness of the community, that in the midst of this persecution, this pressure, this utter marginalization in Iran, the answer that your community gave was to create this incredible secret web of knowledge and support and mentorship. And I love your description of your mother serving tea and cookies after class. You know, it says everything we need to know. And thank you for that testimony. And to my dear friend who spoke about the torture, the imprisonment, the murder, really, of his mother, for many, many years, I personally and my family, the Lantos family and the Lantos Foundation, have been engaged with the Falun Gong community. And there, too, we see this remarkable response of dignity and forbearance and a greater capacity to forgive than I feel I might be able to summon as they face really unimaginable horrors. And I had the duty and sad privilege of interviewing perhaps one of the only known, and his identity is not shared publicly, survivors of a forced organ harvesting attempt who eventually escaped. And it was a very chilling and very tragic and very profound experience to talk to this individual who quietly and calmly shared with us over several hours, because we wanted to capture his testimony and have it as a record, what he had experienced. So we are in this denial of IRF track dealing with circumstances that certainly for those of us who live in the fortunate and blessed environments where we have a huge array of freedoms and protections and options and possibilities, it can feel unimaginable. And I certainly grew up in that world, but I did grow up the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. And so I know. Olivia spoke about how almost from one day to the next, this vibrant center of commerce and democracy and rights became crushed. But it wasn't completely overnight. We saw it coming. We knew it was coming, and we really didn't do much of anything, and that's on us. So I feel so overwhelmed by the testimonies we've just heard, and it's my opportunity and my privilege to now shift to have a conversation with some really important voices from within government, within organizations that hold some power in this space. But one of the really cool things about this Denying IRF track is the way this session has been set up as a dialogue. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to invite some very distinguished voices to come up here and each share some brief opening remarks. I'm going to ask them to stay up here at their seats, and then there will be some civil society members who have been previously chosen. Ask them to come up and respond to what they've heard from our distinguished representatives, and then after they're excused, we'll continue a dialogue with the representatives that I'm going to call up. But before I do, I want to just say one more thing, because it's my understanding that part of what we're here to talk about today is, frankly, that dynamic and that interaction between those who are in more formal positions, those who are part of civil society, those who are themselves, they have experienced what it means to be denied their rights, because solutions do not come from just one place. And quite often, the biggest inspiration comes from those who have the least power. And we need to remember that. And I kind of want to share just two examples from today. So there's someone sitting in the audience, and I don't want to embarrass her, but Nina Shea, who has been a phenomenal human rights activist for a long, long time. She still looks young and beautiful, but she's been at this for quite a few decades. Just yesterday, a very important resolution about Nigeria was introduced in the United States Congress by a real human rights hero, Congressman Chris Smith. But I can tell you that I know who wrote that resolution. I know who made that happen, and I certainly don't want to take anything away from Congressman Smith, but it wasn't his office, and it wasn't just him who did that, but there was a passionate, knowledgeable, expert, civil society human rights activist who did that and who made it happen, and who tirelessly, because Nina and I have worked on a few things together, and she's relentless, you know, in the best possible way. It made that happen. I want to tell you about something that happened this morning at one of the plenary sessions, that I was sort of backstage for the plenary sessions, helping to greet the different guests as they were arriving. And so sometimes when you're doing that job, you don't get to just sit down and listen, which is really what I would like to do. But somehow there was enough of a gap that I was able to listen to one of the individuals who wasn't listed on the program, but was a speaker in between some of the panels. And this was a gentleman, I brought his card with me, by the name of Kola Alapini, a very dignified and distinguished and impressive human rights lawyer from Nigeria, who is representing Yaya Aminu, a Sufi musician who was sentenced to death by hanging for publishing some lyrics. That original sentence was overturned, and another set of charges were brought against him. And this lawyer, who spoke so simply, no bells, no whistles, no razzle-dazzle, he stood there with his papers in his hand and read us his remarks. But it was very profoundly moving, because there he is in a very dangerous place, under very dangerous circumstances, preparing to take one more person who has experienced denial of IRF, take his case to the Supreme Court of Nigeria. And as I understand it, it will be the first time in Nigerian history. Nigeria is one of 7 countries where people can still be sentenced to death for blasphemy. For blasphemy. And blasphemy is a thought crime. Blasphemy is saying things that people don't want you to say. Blasphemy is not a crime. Blasphemy is an exercise of people's freedom to think and believe and say what they want to, even if it might offend others. But he, and I'm sure this puts him in danger as well, is going to be arguing that case before the Nigerian Supreme Court shortly after the elections in 3 weeks. And, you know, I was just so glad that I had the opportunity to listen to him, because it just moved me. And one of my colleagues was back there with me, and I said, you know, we began making up a list of who are the members we can call most easily to get them to reach out to the Nigerian embassy, maybe get them go to the floor and make a statement. I was moved to want to do something right away, because that case is coming up soon. And I think at the end of the day, everybody you're going to hear from today wants that to be the result of this whole track. And I realize I have 1 minute left. Thank you, Hilda. I probably went on longer than I should. It's a problem with my DNA, too much talking. But I hope that things you hear and have heard throughout the summit will cause you to act. You're going to say, oh, you know, I actually know this person. I know this staff person in that senator's office. Or I know this person who works at a newspaper. Or I, you know this organization. So with that, it's my pleasure and honor to ask to join me up here on the stage a number of very distinguished individuals. So if I can ask Fiona Bruce, the Honorable Fiona Bruce. She has been the United Kingdom's Special Envoy, thank you, for freedom of religion and belief for some time, as well as a member of Parliament. Her colleague, David Burrows. I'd like to ask Robert Rehak, the Ambassador for Holocaust, Interfaith Dialogue and International Religious Freedom in the Czech Republic. I would like to ask from my own I call it my own country of Hungary. Both of my parents were Hungarians, so I'm a proud Hungarian American. I'd like to ask State Secretary Tristan Ozbay. It's not a typical Hungarian name. I pride myself on, really bringing that great pronunciation for Hungarian names. Tristan is involved in Hungary's initiatives around aid for the persecuted Christian communities, and he works for the Hungarian Foreign Ministry. And last but most certainly not least, our very distinguished past chair of USERF, president of the IRF Secretariat, a tremendous force for building and developing and growing the IRF movement globally in some really challenging environments, Nadine Maenza. So if I could ask you all to come up here. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So are we first going to have the Zoom from the distinguished UN rapporteur? Very good. Okay, we're also going to be able to hear by Zoom from the UN rapporteur, but we're going to begin with the group we have here on stage, and I think we'll go in the order that you're sitting, starting with you, Fiona. Or starting with Nadine? Oh, Nadine has to go. Okay, now you're getting a look behind the scenes, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's not perfect, but I hope it's still pretty. Nadine, we'll start with you and go down the list that way.
But you're right, really, Fiona should begin, but my apologies. We have so much going on this week, and that's what's so fun about being here, right, is you have an opportunity to hear from so many different panels and people and presentation. But really, I wanted to talk some more about civil society and as being the former chair of USERF, of how important civil society is to government. And I didn't really understand until I joined USERF that we relied on civil society for really almost everything, because we independently assess religious freedom conditions, which means we didn't count on the U.S. government for our information. We really counted on civil society. So we would go on delegations to these sometimes closed countries that people don't get to go to, meet with government, meet with religious leaders. But I'll tell you what, sitting down with the civil society organizations, hearing what the conditions are really like, what their recommendations are, what the U.S. could do to change things, to encourage things, that's like gold to our trip. So it really, that is when I decided to move over to the IRF Secretariat when I had finished my terms, because this was really where the meat of the movement is in civil society.
Cuba, you don't have the possibility to legalize an association, especially those associations who translate religious sentiments, who are religious associations. And I think that the main issue there is because in a totalitarian society, you have to put the state as God and the leader in that time as a messiah. So I think that the first thing, well, you were asking me about the exile issue. Obviously, constructing that network under so much pressure there in Cuba is a challenge. It's always a challenge. But I think also that exile, me and my family get out of the island like a few months ago because of pressure, because kidnapping, because the tensions there, because writing about torture, political prisoners, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. But I think that the exile is also an opportunity. And there are so many generations of Cubans that, for example, Pastor Mario Felix Leonard and Joaxis Marcheco, who are using the exile as a platform to magnify, to amplify the voices of those who are in the island right now. And I think that it's a challenge because those human rights defenders there in Cuba are also under the same pressure or even more. There are so many who are in jail right now. Cuba is the country in the Western Hemisphere with most quantity of, sorry about my English, with more political prisoners. There are more than 1,000 political prisoners, and I think that there is so much pressure over them. But I have so many hopes, so much hope for the situation in Cuba, because even when our people getting out of the country because of pressure, there are all other people there who are standing for truth and standing for liberty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, floor is now open to any questions you may have, but I am going to abuse my position as the moderator and ask a question. Yesterday was a very interesting question that was raised, and it was the role of well, I guess the use of language. So, for example, the Hazaras in Afghanistan have been getting persecuted for a very long time. And one of the things that we have been trying to fight is the censorship of their identity when it comes to reporting, the right use of language. And this is something that we, again, like I said, been fighting with media to not censor their identity when they are reporting these issues, because they would just say it's just another attack on the school, when in reality it was an attack on a Hazara school, because of these are targeted, distinct attacks. So how can we engage with media to ensure that the right use of language can reflect these atrocities being committed against vulnerable communities around the world? Anyone that would like to address it?
Well, to start with, I would say most editions, most outlets nowadays are, everything goes too fast. And checking facts is not one of the priorities when it comes to news editions, unfortunately. And then we have a lack of know-how on what a Hazari, for example, is. And the reporter and the editor, not to step on someone's toes, takes the easy way out. It's an attack on a school in Afghanistan. So therefore, our recommendations are that all the news outlets in the world, and especially state-funded ones like BBC or CBC in Canada and the Swedish television, the Swedish radio, should have the expertise focusing on the different ethnicities and religious minorities and indigenous people in the world that are being persecuted. That expertise is a must in a world that looks like it looks today.
So I would say that's a good ambition, if I might speak from London, as the BBC got a name check there. You're absolutely right. We do need to check the facts. But there is a prior issue of what might be called religious literacy. There's a lack of confidence, I think, sometimes amongst journalists in dealing with these questions. And when they get it wrong and they're criticised for getting it wrong, the response in some quarters is simply to say, well, let's not go there. So one colleague a few years ago, when there was evidence emerging of Christian villagers being chased into the forest in India by Hindu nationalists, it was a kind of, well, this is a story, it merits looking at, but if we report it, well, we might not get it right, and all that we'll do is encourage retaliation. Let's just not do the story at all. So it's expensive to invest time to get these stories right, and money is scarce. The BBC, in the last few weeks, is closing almost 400 posts in the languages services of the World Service. So just in the past week, it's closed BBC Arabic Radio, broadcasting to the Middle East after 85 years. The BBC is also going to close shortly BBC Persian Radio, despite the fact that millions of people rely on it. So the situation is getting worse, it's not getting better. Governments that used to fund the World Service in the UK have decided a few years ago, in fact, that they would stop funding it. And the closure of hundreds and hundreds of journalistic posts is the outcome of this.
Yes, I just want to add. I just want to add that there are so many incomprehensions there in newsrooms. In the particular case of Cuba, there is an ecosystem of independent media, but there is no always the idea that it's important to cover freedom of religion. We are, a group of journalists are making the push, are trying to push in that direction. I think we had some good news over that. But I think that in many newsrooms there is this misconception that freedom of religion is just interesting for people of religious people, and it's a fundamental human right. And I think that also that the founding of a lot of outlets, we have the case of El País, which is one of the most important, if not the most important outlet in Spanish in the world, and they just have to retire their expertise, in religious matter. So it's a challenge. I think that journalists also have to take good stories in order to, it's a challenge for us to, as storytellers. That's what I'm telling. That's what I'm saying. To compromise the audience, to make interesting those stories for the audience. And I just want to repeat two phrases that I heard here in the summit and were very interesting for me, and I think that as well are going to be interesting for you. Marco Respinti says today in the morning, we can change the narrative of the oppressor if we speak truth. That's very powerful. And Greg Stannon in this same room said yesterday, policymakers does not take action because statistics, but because stories. Thank you.
We've got a question from the floor, please.
My name is Julia Bittnell. I'm a colleague and friend of David in London. I worked in the newsroom with David for many years. I left the BBC for exactly the story that David referred to. I was focused on Africa in 2008, 2009. I wasn't focused on India, and I was shocked when I realized that there had been a massacre, and I had no idea about it. And I'm a news junkie. I live and breathe for the BBC News, etc., and I had not had any idea. So I left the BBC 10 years ago to focus on reporting religious freedom. And I want to pick up on the kind of gap that David referred to, and I want this audience to think about this because we keep putting our finger on it, and I keep talking about it, but it seems to be not much is happening. David has just spelled out the cuts in global respected media. At the same time, Aaron Shahinian said in the panel this morning that the digital world has made a kind of an open playing field for people talking about these stories. But there's a gap which falls in the middle, which is where I've been working for 10 years now. And that is, how do you verify the things that people are telling us. I can't tell you. I get numerous video clips coming onto my phone. I have no idea where they come from, what date, who they are on the video. I can't use that. And there is a massive gap between people becoming quote-unquote citizen journalists and the kind of level of veracity that David and I need to take to our ex-BBC colleagues. And this is where it needs investment, it needs funding. And this is what I'm, talking to this group and anyone who's watching. How do we as a sector get more clever? Because people have already said in this plenary, in the summit, that if you like, the Islamist extremists are incredibly clever. They know how to use the media. They know how to sway hearts and minds. But we are too often, we're not willing to collaborate. We're not willing to share intelligence between one NGO. Oh, that's my person. You can't get any information about that story. So often I start digging. I love the way Nuri said, what was it, dig where you stand. I dig and I get stuck because I can't get the information I need. So I'm not sure what the question is, but I just appeal. We need to take this gap in journalism about religious freedom seriously, because otherwise we will never tell the good stories in the way they need to be told to get the world to listen.
Thank you. I've got a question. David, I had the advantage of hearing your video in case you weren't able to be here live. You mentioned when you just spoke some historical examples, and I note that you referred in the video, which we didn't hear about, to Claude Lanzmann and Shoah. We haven't actually mentioned really the Holocaust as such. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And I note, by the way, that one of our co-organizers, Katrina Lantos-Schwett, her father, of course, was Congressman Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor to serve in Congress. It's his birthday today, the late Congressman Lantos. David.
David, did you hear us?
Did you hear my question, David?
So you asked a question about the Holocaust.
Yes, you mentioned in your video, the one that you sent in case you couldn't speak, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, that tremendous documentary, and how that can help us in documentation.
Yes, so I'll just say a few words around that. The key thing about documentation was that, so Lanzmann in his film interviews, there's a scene, a remarkable scene in the opening of the second part of the film, in which he's in a barber shop, I suspect it's in Tel Aviv, with a survivor from one of the camps. And his job in the camps, he was made by the Nazis to cut the hair of everyone going into the gas chambers. And he's asked to describe what happened. And there comes a moment when he breaks down and he asks to stop the interview. And Lanzmann is persistent and gentle. Now, journalists may think at this point, well, just stop filming. But the importance of the moment wasn't lost on Lanzmann, who politely but insistently says, you have to tell us, just do it, he says, tell us, you have to. And the barber picks up and continues to tell the story, which is eyewitness testimony of all those who were then taken from having had their hair cut straight into the gas chambers. The second part, another part of the film, we see the famous Polish underground figure. He went on to he was a diplomat in the underground Polish government, and he went to live in America after the war. In 1941, he was smuggled into a ghetto, but he was also taken in, dressed up as a Latvian guard, into one of the camps. But he didn't get any documentary evidence of what he saw, but he did take out a letter which he brought to London and took to Whitehall and spoke to the British Foreign Office and said, on behalf of the Jewish leadership, this is what's going on. Britain has got to bomb the railway lines, at least into the camps. The response, because he had no evidence of the British Foreign Office, was, well, the Jews, they would say that, wouldn't they? And he went to America, made a plea before Roosevelt, and I think his story of his report of the unfolding genocide against the Jews, I think it made page 18 of the New York Times. And in the film, Karski breaks down in tears with the sense of guilt that he knew things and he wasn't able to convince the world. And I just suggest to you that journalists who know and grasp the evidence that's unfolding around the world in different locations where there is genocide, they are, in part, and compelled to keep searching and discovering and evidencing the testimony of the survivors from the camps, particularly in Xinjiang, and to take their testimony seriously, not to approach it on the basis of, well, the Uyghurs, they would say that, wouldn't they? All I can tell you is that everything I am seeing, and I'm meeting eyewitness survivors and interviewing them at length for many hours, and I am not disregarding their testimony, but I'm certainly corroborating it with the intention of crossing what the BBC calls that evidential threshold.
Catherine's dad was saved by a Swede, the Swedish guy, Raoul Wallenberg, one of our heroes. I was in the jury of a film festival in Sweden, Human Rights Film Festival, and one of my jury members told me he was from Poland and he's Jewish. So I asked him, so you're in 1968 Jew? 1968 means that they fled from Poland all over again, and many of them to Sweden. And he said, yes. I said, okay, so tell me your story. How were you saved? He said, I don't know if it's a big deal or any story at all, but there was a lady, she names, new Christian names or Polish names. And I said, oh, wow, never heard of that. And I should, because I studied the Holocaust, because my ancestors, my grandmother was a survivor of genocide, my grandparents were survivors of genocides. And then I said, is she still around? Yeah, she lives in a poverty house in Poland. I'm like, what? So, going back to stories and not numbers, not figures, we went and saw Irina Sendler. I made one of the first interviews with her, and she became a hero all over the world. It took one coffee with one colleague in a jury.
Amazing.
I think we've got time, unfortunately, at this moment. We have to switch to our third panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, the third panel, we've got Levi, Simon, Vanya, and Havza. Hi. Thank you very much. Please do remain. This session or this panel is as interesting as the previous two. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to start with Levi. Levi is the Executive Director of Falun Dafa International Center. You have 5 minutes, and if I'd like to ask a question, if that's all right. Tell us about your work on reporting attacks on Falun Gong practitioners and the work of the China Tribunal. What was the China Tribunal and what were its findings?
Okay, I'll just get through the highlights there. Maybe we can cover some other in questions. So for those who don't know, Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice involving meditation, slow motion exercises, and the study of Buddhist principles. It was very, very popular in the 1990s. In fact, the Chinese government did a survey, and in 1999 found that there were 70 to 100 million people practicing. And it wasn't just in one region, it was everywhere. It was on university campuses, farmers, housewives, military leaders, even family members of the Politburo. So they saw that many people, and in 1999, a few leaders decided that the entire spiritual practice had to be eradicated, and so that's what we've been dealing with for the last 23 years, rampant imprisonment, torture, killing, and forced organ harvesting. So that leads me, there was really three challenges when it came to documenting, and I think the first challenge is the scope and geographic diversity. This was, again, people that were everywhere in China, and to try and document what was happening to them, the sheer volume and the diversity of location was difficult. That, as well as the fact that it wasn't just prisons and labor camps, the formal institutions where they hold people, black jails, what they call brainwashing centers. They'd even changed schools and Buddhist temples into prisons. And so it was very, very hard to get information out in that way. The second challenge was the fact that Falun Gong information is a state secret. So anybody who does get it out, you yourself put yourself in a lot of risk. In fact, there are people who were themselves imprisoned, tortured. Some died, not because they practiced Falun Gong, but because they reported on somebody who was imprisoned or was mistreated. And the third challenge we face is censorship. It's among the most censored topics and has been for 2 decades. So given those challenges, how would the documentation, how has that occurred? We have been able to document, and one of the primary ways we've done it is something called the Minghui website. And this is a website run by overseas human rights workers, who are a lot of them from China, but they're connected with a very grassroots, decentralized group, people all around China, and every single day for more than 2 decades now, they get dozens of reports coming from inside China, first-hand accounts of what's happening, and that's been invaluable. Also, if you look at, in China, a lot of times you will not see persecution at the national or even the provincial level, but if you look at the local websites and local court verdicts, that's another place where we get documentation of what's been happening. And of course, there's been some great NGO work. Freedom House has done some fantastic reports on Falun Gong. They've probably been the best over the last 10 years. And some investigative reports have been very good. Ian Johnson, almost 2 decades now ago, won the Pulitzer Prize for his series on Falun Gong. But the investigative report has also been a bit of a challenge because it is a third-rail issue. And if you haven't read of Falun Gong on any papers in the last 10 years, well, there's a reason, and the CCP takes that very seriously. So that's sort of the landscape of the documentation. On the tribunal side, so the China Tribunal was convened in 2018 in London by Sir Geoffrey Nice, and he's the prosecutor that some of you may have remembered, brought Milosevic to justice in the former Yugoslavia. And they convened a tribunal in London. Over the course of a year, they had over 50 witnesses come forth, looking at thousands and thousands of pages of documentation. And what they found were basically four things. One, that crimes against humanity, both against Falun Gong and Uyghurs had occurred. Number two, forced organ harvesting had been going on and continues to go on a significant scale, and Falun Gong are indeed the primary targets. There was no evidence, despite what the CCP said, there was no evidence that they had dismantled the infrastructure that would be needed to carry out forced organ harvesting, and so it was continuing. And that indeed it wasn't just forced organ harvesting, they found a lot of evidence of torture, murder, and rape, and so forth. I think it's also important to note what the China Tribunal did in terms of uncovering the scale. They said there were 60 to 100,000 transplants per year. So if you look at just the Falun Gong community alone, over the 15 years or so we have of evidence of forced organ harvesting, hundreds of thousands would have died, would have been killed in this process. And so that was one of the China Tribunal was a significant and important documentation milestone of forced organ harvesting, not just against Falun Gong, but other groups. And I think other tribunals have since come about, like the Uyghur Tribunal in 2021, doing the same thing. Very, very important in terms of uncovering what's really going on inside China. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a chance to hear from Simon Bagahakian, who is a visiting scholar at Tufts University and a PhD student in heritage crime at Cranfield University. I've got a question here. You've been working on the use of remote technologies, satellites in particular, for documenting, exposing, and deterring state-sponsored erasure of sacred sites. Could you briefly tell us about this work and what is being done with the evidence?
As soon as I find out how to turn it on. Or I'll just take yours. Thank you so much for that question. And before I talk about satellites, I want to start my timer and also mention an important lesson that I think most of us have learned, all of us have learned throughout our school and our lives, and that is when you tell a story, it's not important as much as what you say, but how you say it. And how is not just about the style of it, but also capturing your audience, being credible, comprehensive, and giving the full context. But I think in recent years, especially as it was alluded to earlier, there is so much information that it's also important of the medium that we choose. And nothing seems more captivating these days than satellites or geospatial technology. But there are also shortcomings to that, and I want to talk about that as well. So 20 years ago, I was watching the news as a, well, more like 18 years, 17, 18 years ago. I was watching the news. I was in college myself, and I learned that the world's largest medieval Armenian cemetery was being destroyed, a place called Julfa or Jura. And I was very naive, so I went to CNN and BBC to see if this was being reported. That day, the next week, the following month, nothing was happening. And as a kid at the time, whose parents, whose family had gone through the Armenian genocide and the community traumatized with the denial of the Armenian genocide, I was like, gee, I wish we don't have to go through this in another 100 years to prove that this actually happened. So one of the first things I did, I got a hold of a satellite image that was available for purchase for $300 of the cemetery. This was 2006 or so. That showed the cemetery, but not to the fullest destruction because I only managed to buy one, and it was used in a video. And a few years later, I was working in Amnesty International. Through that, I got to know the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where they had the Human Rights for Science project, or vice versa, Science for Human Rights, and we ended up doing the very first, or one of the first, cultural crime investigations, a heritage crime investigation with satellites, which unfortunately had to become very popular, you know, when ISIS started targeting the sacred sites of Assyrians, Yazidis, Muslims, and so many others in Iraq and in Syria. Now, fast forward that to our days. Let's fast forward it today. Today is day 53 of an ongoing blockade of an Armenian region called Nagorno-Karabakh, that Nuri also referenced by its Armenian name, Artsakh, earlier. A blockade that's pretty clear that the international community has condemned, but yet it continues. And the perpetrator now is saying that it's not happening, it's not a blockade, and all that it would take to prove it was to run satellites. Not that this will stop the perpetrator from denying, but this could happen. And actually, as I was listening to the very interesting conversations, I was conversing with an important journalist who does visual investigations, asking him to talk to the editor again to see if they will run the satellites. Because there was an ICJ, International Court of Justice hearing, just 2 days ago on this issue, and they're expected to make a decision. And unless you have solid proof like satellites, you know, they might be confused with the narratives of what the perpetrator, State Azerbaijan, is trying to make it sound. He said, she said. And this was exactly the case with the cemetery that was destroyed, the world's largest medieval Armenian cemetery. Now, I did more research into that, and it turned out that this was actually the grand finale, that the entire landscape made of Armenian history was expunged, surgically removed from the face of the earth. And it was not until 2 years ago that when I worked with an organization called Caucasus Heritage Watch, we found declassified U.S. spy satellites from the Soviet era. We compared baseline imagery with the imagery from more recent times, and everything was wiped out. And Azerbaijan's ambassador responded to that investigation in the art newspaper by saying non-existing heritage sites cannot be destroyed. Well, it sounds, you know, very foolish and evil to deny destruction like that, but it actually helped Armenia win a case at the ICJ in December 2021 when Azerbaijan was ordered to stop destroying Armenian monuments. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that it's not what you say, but how you say it. But unfortunately, satellites having become too popular, now we've moved to the next level of where you say it. Because even though Bellingcat and so many other wonderful organizations are running the satellites, unfortunately today a lot of the attention is being paid to the papers of record and the way they covered satellite imagery. So one thing I would want to warn against is not to over-rely on satellite imagery, even though it can also be very black and white, and trust stories from the ground as well, from the people, especially those who are going through the suffering, and not let the perpetrator both side human rights violations. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy moderating when everyone sticks to the time, so thank you for doing that. Our next speaker is Vanya Womack, who is the Executive Director Refugees Unknown Stories Untold, which is a fantastic initiative. Vanya, you are documenting the stories for refugees. What can we learn from these stories? How do the stories change as time goes by, especially when the refugees are stuck in limbo for many years?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to start by telling you a story. Ubakir and Gonca were both teachers caught up in the aftermath of the failed Turkish coup in 2016. They both spent time in prison. Gonca was pregnant, and now they were waiting again for their sentencing. When they found out that they were going to serve 7 and 8 years in prison for having an app on their phone, they decided to leave. Gonca Kara, along with her husband and 3 young children, were forced to flee their own country. They used all of their savings and the sale of their belongings to get on a boat with 12 others headed to Greece, where they would claim asylum. They didn't want to go, they didn't ask to go, but they were forced to go. In the darkness of the night, it was hard to tell the sea from the sky. The only way was to follow the white tips of the waves. There they were, out in the middle of the Aegean Sea, on a cold night, with a wind that pierced and a silence that was haunting. Suddenly, the skipper made a hard turn with this dingy plastic boat, and everyone fell into the water. Gonca and her husband were swept farther and farther away from the overturned boat, clinging on to one another as they bobbed in the water in their old and worn orange life jackets supplied to them by the smugglers. From a distance, they heard somebody yell, "I have the baby! I have the baby!" When the boat flipped that terrible night, another couple, a lawyer, and his wife, a medical doctor, suddenly found themselves holding on to a 1-year-old baby in the water. This baby was Ali Hassan, the youngest child of Ubakir and Gonca. It would be on the rescue boat that the Karas were reunited with their little one, but they also realized their 2 precious children, Guslam 10 and Mustafa 7, were not among those rescued. In the words of Gonca, she buried her own children on an island in Greece, overlooking the distance, the only home they ever knew, Turkey. Just a month after this tragedy, I sat in a small and scarcely furnished flat that the United Nations had put them in. I looked at the shells of 2 bodies sitting across from me. The emotionless face of a mother who was recently ready to give up on life, and the forlorn look of a man who had just lost his reason for living. And a little boy so traumatized by the water that night that it seemed as though he had forgotten about the incident and just innocently wondered where his brother and sister were. After a moment of silence, Gonca said to me, "Vanya, I lost my children in search of freedom." Now, I believe that I've got pretty good EQ when it comes to looking at an audience and being able to tell when a story touches an audience. You were impacted, right? Feelings of empathy and compassion and yearning to know more about the content that I just shared with you. So I gave you a first-hand story of Turkish citizens who had to leave because they were politically oppressed. They're people who happened to find themselves in a situation where they were vilified and scapegoats. So these stories about the current Turkish forced migration victims are almost never shared. These stories are untold, and these stories are refugees unknown. So at my organization, we work to make these voices heard by telling their stories and digitally archiving them. Every refugee story is important, but we focus on these ones as they are underreported and need our attention because they challenge our preconceived notions about who refugees are. The Kara family, like hundreds of thousands of others like them, didn't leave Turkey because of a civil war, a foreign occupation, or a natural disaster. These mostly middle-class and upper-middle-class citizens who were very active in civil life were declared by the current government to be persons non grata and eventually flat-out terrorists. So what do you do when your very own government doesn't want you in your own land? It's only through the power of stories that we can come closer to a real understanding of the conditions that result in human atrocities. So how do these stories change as time goes by, especially when, like, refugees are in limbo? The Kara family I just talked about has another side to their tragic story. That one I think is so important that we don't often tell about, and that's resilience. I believe that this part of Untold Stories can sound an alarm and alert those governments who commit human rights violations like Turkey. They commit atrocities, putting women and children and babies in prisons, restricting their access to fundamental rights and education, torture, rape, and social death from the government's rhetoric. By talking about resilience, we can bring up something that dictators do not foresee. Those dissidents who have to leave their homelands become refugees and find new homes where they build new and many times successful lives. When regimes persecute, shouldn't they hear about the resilience of those suffering that they caused? There's a whole other side to trauma, grief, psychological effects, loss of religious community, and loss of education that a purge of intellectuals has. I visited that Kara family several times. This last summer, I was able to visit them in their new home in Germany. Ubakir is working in Gonja. She is now the director of the Tenkil Museum, which travels throughout Europe, telling stories along with the belongings of those who have been lost to torture, the sea, and forced disappearances. I'm a published academic who now teaches adjunct courses like refugees and forced migration at Villanova University. I'm a human rights storyteller and an activist speaking out on tyrannical regimes and those who persecute based on religion and political ideologies. So for the past 5 years now, I've been collecting these stories on the ground of victims of forced migration in Europe due primarily to the Turkish purge and oppression due to the 2016 failed coup attempt. I'm the executive director of an organization called Refugees Unknown Stories Untold, which you can find at refugeesunknown.org. And I'm telling these stories of forced migration and human rights violations and digitally archiving them, creating a larger picture to tell a bigger story about the atrocities committed by governments and regimes. I'm currently concentrating, as I mentioned, on stories from the Turkish refugees and writing a book as well, using these stories to show a type of genocide, a silent genocide of the people associated specifically with the Hizmet movement. With today's daily advances in technology and more unique ways to eliminate groups of people, we must move beyond what we are familiar with. Imagine if we could continue to create digital archives full of first-hand stories. What a much bigger story that would tell. We can sound an alarm for change. The impact that stories have on research, on policy, on religious freedom is vital to gaining first-hand knowledge. Stories or testimonies are used to indict tyrannical regimes and individuals for violating international human rights laws, as we know. Telling stories can also be used to educate people, as we know. And stories can be used to impact governments at the policy level. So I hope that we can combine the silos that we work in, where many of us do similar or we do related kinds of work, and that we can utilize our strengths together. Because in solidarity together, we can make a change. And I also want to add that we need to make sure that we're on the forefront. When we look at technology, why aren't we talking about more technology here? Why are we not at the forefront looking to see metaverse? What are the newest things that are coming into academia that people are going to be able to work across the world together in very soon? I think that we're missing that portion when it comes to religious freedom and many other things that we've been talking about here at the conference. So thank you.
We'll now be pleased to hear from Hafsa Kirdap, who's the Executive Director of Advocates of Silenced Turkey, AST, and also a scholar. Hafsa, what is the role of academia in documenting violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief? What are the best approaches to engage academia, and what are the challenges that you faced?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I am an activist and I am an academic at the same time, and I want to talk about how both academic and activist work can come together and make an impact in terms of human rights and, of course, religious freedom. And let me start with the first part, academics. The academic research, as just you may know, is the audience of the academic research is limited. But one thing we can do is merge the works in academia with the works in grassroots, and so that we can reach out to decision makers, policy makers, to be able to make changes. Yes, academics are doing really good stuff. I mean, they are doing qualitative studies, quantitative studies, they are pulling numbers together, but still the audience is limited. In civil society, we have activists who have a broader and diverse network. Using documentation of human rights violations, including religious and faith-based, I foresee a better collaboration between the theoretical works and practical works. I am a Turkish dissident, just one you just touched on. Yes, atrocities are generated and conducted by states initially, and it happens in Turkey. It's the same there. But the state-led discrimination and violence against different faith groups in the society are making really good impact because the governments, as just Turkish government, use a really very powerful religious discourse, which is ironic, and society takes such discrimination and violence further. The situation for religious freedom in Turkey is concerning, really concerning, considering the restrictive government regulations and the sharp rise in vandalism in the society. For example, in 2022, 28 imams, the religious leaders in Islam, were detained for preaching in Kurdish. So this is both religious and ethnic discrimination and oppression. In separate incidents, several Alawi's homes, it's a sect in Islam again, were tagged and trashed. An unidentified group of people broke into and vandalized an Alawi home of worship, Cemevi. It's called Cemevi. The government consistently fails to prevent and punish these vandalism cases, which is against religious, practices, including houses of worship and cemeteries, even cemeteries, which results in damage and in some cases destruction. And the last but not the least case that I want to give you as an example, in 2021, the President Erdogan just signed a decree transforming the Hagia Sophia, which is a historical site, back into a mosque. And unfortunately, a sword was raised aloft by the Religious Affairs Director at the first Friday prayers that performed at the former Greek Orthodox Cathedral as a symbol of conquest, which many denounced as a marginalizing message into the religious minorities. I have given you a little background. Now I want to tell you about me. My faith is the same faith as the Turkish government. Yet I have been persecuted as a Turkish citizen, along with hundreds of thousands of other people who follow a faith-based social movement called Hizmet movement, just one you just mentioned, just because speaking against oppression and corruption. These people are being prevented from performing religious gatherings that are called sohbet, and denied religious burial services, and prohibited from supporting charities that they choose because these charities were shut down by the government. The Turkish government has put out a wanted list for dissidents, and I'm on that list. I'm worth 500,000 Turkish liras, if you denounce me, along with Enes Kanter, Freedom, and along with other, intellectuals. So I have 1 minute, so I have to go faster. So I'm conducting research on violence against women from these groups that I mentioned, Kurdish, Yazidi, Alevi, trans women, women from Hizmet movement. And in a sense, I'm documenting these human rights violations and atrocities. But things got worse against those people. So let me ask you, why aren't we, as scholars, as religious leaders, as human rights advocates just like you, and policymakers coming together and using our combined strengths to document persecutions? In this room, we have academics, we have religious leaders, we have advocates, and we have policymakers, I believe. Together, we can make a change and strive for a common goal of creating awareness and taking action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanya. Thank you for that story. I work really closely with Hazara refugees in Indonesia who's been stuck there for over, some of them 20 years. Second generation now with absolutely no idea of what the future may hold. But Hafsa, I had a question for you as an academic. So we did an inquiry into the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan and Pakistan, recently published that report where we, assessment was that Hazaras are a serious risk of genocide. But unfortunately, one of the challenges that we faced was the lack of academic data on the Hazaras. So how can we engage academics to engage on these issues, to analyze early warning signs of genocide, and how can we then use these data and research for accountability and ending impunity in these countries where, Turkey, Afghanistan, where these communities are getting persecuted?
I think we have two steps to be able to, achieve this. I am attending different conferences having different themes. This is a human rights kind of conference, and I'm also attending academics conferences, which have different goals and different setups. We can make, interferences in different conferences. For example, I'm an academic, and I can come to the human rights, conferences. And human rights advocates should go to the academics conferences. Then they can, raise awareness. And after that, when the academics are aware of these, atrocities, they want to do something to be able to make change. And for example, I am working with lots of different academics who have no idea about Hazara people, about Turkish people, about Armenian people. So in that way, we are, first of all, raising awareness together with these academics, and now we are archiving stories just like Vanya, but in the academic world. We are doing qualitative study, interviewing these people, having their perspective, having their stories, life stories, true stories, and archiving them. And then we are using the theory, the theoretical framework from human rights organizations, from some sociologists, some psychologists, and then we are merging them in academic papers so that we are widening the audience in that case. I hope this answers response to your question.
I've got a question for Simon. For all of us, the use of satellite images, I understand how this is used in agriculture. I understand how it is used for historians to track historical changes. For what you are talking about, the disappearance of sacred sites, what is the threshold of evidence that's needed? How do you find the expertise to interpret images that are often very difficult to understand what's happening on the ground? The disappearance of a cemetery, for example, that you mentioned. What's the process? What are the standards?
Thank you for that question. So baseline imagery is a requirement, and I referenced it earlier, and there is not baseline imagery for everything. We're familiar with cultural destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhists that happened in the early 2000s, but there was so much more destruction that happened earlier. And unfortunately, there's no baseline imagery because this part of the world that I study was part of the Soviet Union, so thankfully because of that there is Soviet era and Cold War era baseline imagery. Now, assuming there is imagery, the type of information that I have been looking at is unfortunately very clear-cut. You have an entire monastic complex in one picture and not even a trace or an outline of its foundations in the other one. But I think the question goes to how do you use satellite observations to deter cultural destruction, especially of a site that has gone under the control of a known perpetrator of cultural erasure, which is exactly what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh in the last 2 years. Hundreds of more Armenian sites went under the control of Azerbaijan, and there is this amazing organization that I referenced earlier, Caucasus Heritage Watch, that is observing the situation. And the question is, what tools do they use? And I've been collaborating with them, so I could mention that in the work that they're trying to use often for deters and early warning sites, it's looking at other activities that might be going on around a major sacred site, especially if it's not inhabited and it does not have any other infrastructure around it. If there is a new road construction or some sort of other facility that's being built around it, oftentimes they will use them as warning sites of the activity. But unfortunately, and I think and this is obvious to even those who don't use satellites, we don't have constant access to satellites unless, there are some governments that do have a 24/7 view, and sometimes it's too late. And that's why I was referring to not having over-reliance on satellites. But in terms of I think going more back to specifically to your question is, different parts of destruction, right? Because not every destruction is complete eradication. And that's a major problem because the Armenian monuments that are under Azerbaijani control are rich in Armenian inscriptions. And the Azerbaijani government has made it clear that they intend to eradicate this epigraphic heritage. So unless there's signs of scaffolding or other signs of activity, it would be hard to even suspect that there has been activity around the captured sites. And in addition to that, all that a perpetrator has to do is just to wait for a cloudy day because satellites will not capture it. So there are a lot of limitations, and I think it's important to keep trusting local sources, but also using a variety of ways of documenting destruction. I'll make reference to a major publication that I did with a Yale historian named Sarah Pickman. We on purpose left out most of the satellite evidence and used other evidence to show that the 28,000 medieval Armenian monuments of Nakhichevan was eradicated by the government of Azerbaijan, and on purpose for that particular study, we did not want to rely on satellites because there are so many other ways of getting the information out.
So the floor is open if anyone would like to ask any questions. There's a mic over there. Until then, Levi, please use that mic.
My name is Kevin Haidari. I am a Hazara activist from Afghanistan, from the same ethnicity Dr. Humaira is. I grew on or inside refugee camps, but today I'm here to speak about the atrocities that is happening for the long time on my community and other minority communities in Afghanistan. Particularly, we the Hazaras face a long genocide in Afghanistan that has been happening before the eyes of international community in the past 20 years presence in Afghanistan, and as well as overall international community have been witnessing the genocide of Hazaras since the late 1800s. Between 1887 to 1892, we lost over 62% of our population under direct command of the King of Afghanistan and the military. A book called The History of Afghanistan from 1260 to the present, published by Dr. Jonathan Lee, a European professor, on the page number 397 to 399 says, overall 50% of Hazara men died as a direct and indirect result of that war that was imposed on Hazaras. Since then, we are facing genocide in Afghanistan. If you hear on the media, school bombing, college bombing, education centers have been bombed, maternity wards have been bombed, babies have been killed, women have been sold as a sexual slavery, or if you hear about men or women have been pulled out of the buses over the highways and got beheaded, if you hear about bombing on sports complexes, if you hear about bombing inside the city, that's all over happening on Hazara community. Besides that, like I was listening to your distinguished panel, that what if the country's government force you to flee the country and they do not accept you as your citizens? Yes, that's happening on us. Today, the regime who is controlling Afghanistan has a clear slogan. They say, Tajiks of Afghanistan should go to Tajikistan. The Uzbeks of Afghanistan should go to Uzbekistan. But the Hazaras should go to Goristan. Goristan means a graveyard. It's not any country or not any Istan that any other Muslim countries would share the territory. So my future territory or my generation's territory on the basis of the faith and the beliefs of the current regime who is controlling Afghanistan is a graveyard. We do not have the right to live in this world. So thus, my question is, beside this, the beautiful diversity of my country is eliminating. The Jewish population have been totally whitewashed. We had over 100,000 Sikhs and Hindu believers in the past 1 century in Afghanistan living. The last group was departing over a month ago, which was over less than 20 families. And I'm not sure if we got any families left in the country. So with all these atrocities that's happening around the world, in Turkey, in Libya, or XYZ, in Europe, or in Africa, I was hearing, in Latin America, or even complaints of discrimination in the United States, if all these atrocities happen, what is the role of international community or the UN member states? What is the role of United Nations with the responsibility to protect? If communities such as us flee the country, like we have been left with unprecedented future around the world. My Hazara community, refugees are living with full uncertainty in Indonesia and many other countries, and yet United Nations does not register them, UNHCR do not register them. So where is the world ending at the end? If anybody could address this, please. Thank you.
Anyone would like to address that?
May I say,
Please,
just very briefly, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the media coverage and global conversations about issues are very geopoliticized, right? Afghanistan was #1 news in the world because the United States was invading it. Now we are following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, trying to stop that, right? And all the attention is on Ukraine. And I know this is not addressing your question, but I think one thing that has to happen, and this is not the auditorium for that, but I think global media, mainstream media have an important role to play. And this is a thing that they have to deal with one day, is that do media outlets have a social responsibility to spotlight potential and ongoing cases of genocide regardless of geopolitics? And I think unless they answer yes to that question, we're going to hear the silence of so many of those atrocities. And there's so many. I mean, how many times we heard about Tigrayans at this conference? 600,000 Tigrayans died in the last 2 years. Sure, it was not because of religious beliefs, but this is one of the worst genocides that is happening. And it's not a geopolitical story, so even a conference like this is not spotlighting it.
Can I add just a very small thing on top of what Simon said? So we are hearing stories, not stories, but just news, technical news from the media outlets, but not the stories of Hazara people. I don't know if anyone knows any Hazara personal story. What Maya mentioned, these personal stories are much more touching. And as just Simon mentioned, we have to take these stories to the media outlets more. First of all, we have to archive them. For example, in my country, all Turkish, they are persecuting their own citizens, their own faith fellows. There are pregnant women in, jails right now, arbitrarily incarcerated. There are, postpartum. There are women in postpartum. There are, women with babies right now in Turkish jails. So we are archiving these stories, and we are somehow writing articles or making news, and we are sharing them with media outlets or with any mechanisms that the world can hear, person by person.
Outside the world, in the world, we the Hazaras, if we have any good thing and achievement, the Afghan government take the credit. They say an Afghan citizen made this achievement. But in Afghanistan, if we talk about sharing resources, access to resources, participation, civil rights, then we're Hazaras.
That's why personal stories matter.
And the international report as well exclude this. They highlight every incident as general Afghan, and then no touch on Hazara community was facing genocide.
Yeah.
I just want to answer your question real quick with a statement. We need to show them what they need to do. And what I mean by that is that obviously those stories are not out, right? So, and we've been waiting. We know all of these different minority groups that have been persecuted. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting for stories to come out. We've been waiting for something to get done. I think that it's at a point now where we need to show them the way to get things done. Does that make sense from our point of view, in a sense, in regards to policy level? And I think the more that we can do that, the more they see a roadmap in front of them of what it is to do. So it was a little longer than a statement, but that's what I say.
Thank you so much to every of our panelists. Excuse me. And the other two panelists, as well as you guys, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to moderate this session. Just one quick note, because I was in yesterday's documenting track as well, and I think it's horrendous to see that there's a huge increase on violation of freedom of religious belief, and yet we heard from David that there's a reduction on services for documentation and reporting. And documentation is it's one of the most important thing that we need for accountability and justice, and yet everywhere all communities are struggling to document this. But at the same time, it's really nice to see that there are different initiatives to document and to archive, whether it's through stories, whether it's using the satellite, whether it's reporting or other initiatives available for documentation. And I really, really hope that this has been useful, and I know it has been useful for me, so thank you so much.